My fingers trembled as I stared at the number 297,142 or 16 burning into my vision, tears blurring the edges of the bank statement. My husband of 8 years had emptied our joint accounts, maxed out our credit cards, and vanished with my former best friend, leaving me drowning in debt. Just as the full weight of betrayal crashed over me, my phone lit up with a notification from the lending institution where I'd just been hired. The name on the loan application made my blood freeze. Robert Wilson, my soon-to-be ex-husband, was requesting a $450,000 business loan, and I had been assigned as his loan officer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday. The September sun streamed through our bedroom curtains, painting golden stripes across the Egyptian cotton sheets that Robert had insisted were worth the extravagant price tag. I reached across to his side of the bed, finding it cold and empty as usual. Robert's financial consulting job often took him away for days at a time, at least that's what I believed. I stretched and slipped into my morning routine, brewing coffee in the kitchen of our suburban dream home. The house that we'd stretched our finances thin to afford, with its sprawling backyard and modern open-concept design, had been Robert's choice. "We deserve this, Natalie," he'd said when I expressed concerns about the mortgage. "My career is taking off, trust me." And I had trusted him. Completely. I was sipping my coffee when I noticed the blinking light on our landline answering machine, a relic we kept mostly for emergencies. Strange, since most people contacted us on our cell phones. I pressed play, expecting perhaps a telemarketer or a wrong number. "Mrs. Wilson," a formal voice announced, "this is Patricia Mills from Evergreen Credit Union. There seems to be an issue with your recent transaction. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." My brow furrowed. I hadn't made any unusual transactions. Still holding my coffee mug, I dialed the number with my free hand, my wedding ring catching the morning light as I punched in the digits. Evergreen Credit Union, Patricia speaking. "Hi, this is Natalie Wilson. I received your message about a transaction." The pause on the other end lasted a beat too long. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson. We wanted to verify the withdrawal of $178,000 from your joint savings account yesterday afternoon. Given the size of the transaction, it triggered our security protocols." The mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the tile floor, coffee splashing across my bare feet. I barely noticed the heat. I didn't make that withdrawal," I managed to say, my voice suddenly hoarse. The withdrawal was made in person by Robert Wilson. He presented proper identification and provided all necessary security information, Patricia explained, her tone shifting to something gentler, perhaps sensing my shock. "There must be a mistake," I insisted, though even as the words left my mouth, a cold dread was spreading through my chest. After hanging up, I frantically called Robert. No answer. I texted, emailed, even tried messaging him on social media. Silence. With trembling hands, I logged into our online banking portal, an account I rarely checked since Robert handled our finances, insisting it played to his professional strengths as a financial consultant. The truth stared back at me in black and white. Not only had our savings been drained, but our checking account balance read a paltry $342.17. Credit card statements showed maxed-out limits with recent charges at luxury hotels, high-end restaurants, and an exclusive jewelry store. As I scrolled through transaction after transaction, a text message notification appeared on my phone. My friend, well, I thought she was my friend, Vanessa. "I'm so sorry, Nat. I never meant for it to happen this way." Attached was a photo of her and Robert, toasting champagne glasses on what looked like a private terrace overlooking crystal blue waters. Her wrist sparkled with a diamond bracelet I'd never seen before. The geotag read, Santorini, Greece. My best friend since college. The woman who'd been my maid of honor. The confidant who'd listened to my marital frustrations over countless glasses of wine. Another text arrived. Robert wanted to tell you himself, but he said you wouldn't understand his need for freedom. He says the house and remaining assets should cover most of what he borrowed. He'll have his lawyer contact you about the divorce. Most of what he borrowed? I felt sick. I spent the next hours in a daze, combing through every financial document I could find in our home office. Behind a false bottom in his desk drawer, a hiding spot I discovered only by accidentally dropping a pen that rolled beneath the desk, I found loan agreements, second mortgages, and credit card statements addressed to a P.O. box I didn't recognize. The full picture emerged with horrifying clarity. Robert had systematically leveraged every asset we owned, funneling money into secret accounts while maintaining our lavish lifestyle. The total debt left in my name amounted to just under $300,000. As the sun set on the longest day of my life, I sat on my kitchen floor, back against the refrigerator, surrounded by papers documenting my financial ruin. 8 years of marriage, dissolved into numbers on spreadsheets and legal jargon designed to protect him and burden me. I was 34 years old, working as an administrative assistant at a small accounting firm, making barely enough to cover basic expenses, let alone the crushing debt now hanging over my head. My salary wouldn't even cover the minimum payments. Bankruptcy loomed in my future like an approaching storm. That night I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I sat in stunned silence, mentally retracing every moment of our marriage, looking for signs I'd missed. The late nights at the office, the business trips that seemed to multiply, the way he'd grown increasingly secretive about his phone, the sudden interest in keeping fit, buying new clothes, classic signs of an affair that I'd willfully ignored. But beyond the betrayal of his infidelity was the calculated financial destruction he'd orchestrated. This wasn't a crime of passion or a relationship that had simply run its course. This was methodical, planned, cruel. I slept on the couch that night, unable to face our bed. In the morning, with eyes dry and burning from lack of sleep, I called, in sick to work, and contacted a lawyer, one who wasn't part of Robert's social circle. The consultation was free, but the prognosis was bleak. Since most of these loans and cards are in both your names, and as his spouse, you're likely to be held equally responsible, the lawyer explained. We can fight it, especially given the circumstances, but these cases can take years and the legal fees alone. Her voice trailed off, and I understood. I couldn't afford to fight this properly, not on my salary. As I drove home from the lawyer's office, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number with the city's area code. "Is this Natalie Wilson?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, speaking." "This is Sandra Patel from First Capital Financial. We received your application last week, and I'm pleased to inform you that we'd like to offer you the position of junior loan officer. Your background in administrative work combined with your associate's degree in business made you stand out among our applicants." I nearly swerved off the road. The job application I'd submitted months ago, back when I'd been quietly trying to build some financial independence, sensing something wasn't right in my marriage, though unable to name it. "The position starts next Monday, if that works for you," Sandra continued. "The starting salary is $65,000, with benefits beginning after your 90-day probationary period." It wasn't enough to immediately solve my financial nightmare, but it was significantly more than I was making now. It was a lifeline, slim, but real. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "Monday is perfect." What I didn't know then, as I hung up the phone with a spark of hope kindling in my chest, was that First Capital Financial was about to become the stage for a confrontation I could never have imagined. That in just 7 days, the man who had destroyed my life would walk through those doors, seeking money, expecting a stranger, and finding me instead. But for that moment, driving home to my empty house with its mountain of debt, I held on to one thought. I wasn't going to let Robert Wilson destroy me. not completely, not without a fight. Robert and I met during my final year of community college. I was working part-time at a local cafe while finishing my associate's degree in business, determined to build a better life than my struggling single mother had been able to provide. He walked in wearing a tailored suit that stood out among the usual crowd of students and neighborhood regulars, ordered a complicated espresso drink, and left a tip that matched the cost of his order. The next day, he returned at the same time. And the day after that. By the end of the week, he knew my name, my schedule, and had somehow maneuvered me into agreeing to dinner. "You're different," he told me that night at a restaurant far too expensive for my budget. "Most women I meet are just after what I can give them. But you're building something on your own." His words warmed me in places that had been cold for too long. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At 22, I'd spent years being practical, responsible, and fiercely independent. Robert Wilson, with his confident smile and tales of financial success at 30, represented everything I aspired to become. "I'm going places, Natalie," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "And I think you're someone who could keep up." I should have recognized the subtle condescension in his words, the implication that I would be following rather than walking beside him. But his attention felt like validation, proof that my hard work and ambition were finally being recognized. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Weekend trips to nearby cities, gifts that I initially resisted but eventually accepted, and constant reassurances that I deserved these luxuries, that I was investing in our future by supporting his career. 6 months after we met, he proposed with a diamond ring that must have cost more than my yearly salary. "We're a team now," he said as he slid it onto my finger. "Together, we'll have everything." The first 3 years of our marriage seemed to confirm his promise. Robert's career as a financial consultant flourished. He specialized in helping wealthy clients manage and grow their assets, and his client list expanded rapidly. My role evolved from pursuing my own career to managing our home and supporting his professional networking. "You have a way with people," he would tell me after dinner parties where I'd charmed his colleagues and clients. "You make them trust me more." It was during our 3rd year of marriage that the subtle imbalance began to solidify into something more troubling. My administrative job at the accounting firm was meant to be temporary, a stepping stone while I pursued further education. But whenever I raised the subject of returning to school, Robert found reasons for delay. "The timing isn't right financially," he'd say, despite our apparently comfortable lifestyle. Or, "You're so valuable where you are. They depend on you." And my personal favorite, "Why stress yourself with more responsibility? I make enough for both of us." I remembered one particular evening after I'd mentioned a bachelor's degree program in finance that offered evening classes. "Finance?" Robert laughed, swirling his whiskey. "That's cute. You know how competitive that field is? Most people who've been in it for years barely understand what I do." "I'm not asking to do what you do," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice level. "I just want to grow my own skills." He set down his glass and crossed the living room to where I sat, placing his hands on my shoulders. "Natalie, think about it logically. The money you'd spend on tuition could go toward our next vacation or home renovations, things we'd both enjoy. Besides," he added with a kiss to my forehead, "one financial expert in the family is enough." That was the pattern. Each time I pushed for independence, he would counter with a loving logic that made my desires seem impractical or selfish. When I suggested having my name added to our investment accounts, he explained that his specialized strategies were too complex to divide. Oversight. When I questioned large purchases, he reminded me that financial management was his area of expertise. "Do you trust me?" became his refrain whenever I asked too many questions. And because I did trust him, because I had built my life around, that trust, I would retreat, doubting my own instincts. By our 5th anniversary, I had settled into the role he had crafted for me, the supportive wife who maintained our social calendar, kept our home running smoothly, and reflected well on him professionally. I told myself it was a partnership of complementary strengths. He built our financial future, I built our social foundation. Only in retrospect did I see how skillfully he maintained control. The credit cards were all in his name, with me as an authorized user, a setup he claimed optimized our credit benefits. Our mortgage, though for our shared home, was primarily in his name for tax purposes. Even my car was leased through his business. I had access to spending money, of course. A joint checking account received regular transfers that covered household expenses, with enough left over for personal purchases that wouldn't raise eyebrows. But the larger financial picture, our investments, savings, retirement plans, remained firmly in his domain. "Financial planning is what I do for a living, Nat," he would say with that smile that made his clients trust him with millions. "Would you want me second-guessing how you organize our social calendar?" Looking back, I could trace when things truly began to shift. It was about 2 years ago when Robert started working with a new circle of wealthier, more exclusive clients. His hours grew longer, his business trips more frequent. He upgraded his wardrobe, bought a more impressive car, and became obsessed with appearances in a way that went beyond his usual attention to detail. Around the same time, Vanessa returned to our lives. We'd been close in college, but her marketing career had taken her abroad for several years. Her return coincided with Robert's new professional phase, and she quickly became a regular presence at our dinner table, sharing stories of European capitals and Asian business centers that aligned perfectly with Robert's aspirations. "Vanessa really gets the world we're moving into," Robert commented after one such dinner. "That kind of global perspective is invaluable." I'd nodded, ignoring the implication that my perspective was, by comparison, limited. Instead, I was grateful for my friend's return, for having someone who knew me before I was Robert's wife. Vanessa and I would meet for lunch or shopping when Robert was working late, and I confided in her my growing sense of restlessness. "He means well," I told her during one such lunch. "He works so hard for our future. I just sometimes feel like I'm losing myself in his shadow." "Men like Robert need to feel in control," she replied, something knowing in her eyes that I completely misinterpreted. "It's how they're wired. But maybe you could find something just for you, a hobby or volunteer work." Her suggestion, I now realized, was perfectly calibrated to keep me occupied without threatening the status quo. Just as Robert's occasional encouragement for me to treat myself to a spa day or weekend trip with friends served to release pressure without addressing the fundamental imbalance in our relationship. 6 months before everything imploded, I made my last significant push for independence. I applied for the loan officer position at First Capital Financial without telling Robert. It was a small act of rebellion, a test of whether I could still make decisions without his approval. When the application disappeared into the bureaucratic void with no response, I took it as confirmation that perhaps Robert was right. Perhaps I wasn't equipped for the financial world after all. How tragically ironic that the response to that application would arrive at the precise moment when I discovered just how thoroughly Robert had betrayed both my trust and our financial security. As if the universe had finally decided to rebalance the scales, placing in my hands the small but significant power to affect Robert's future, just as he had so dramatically altered mine. My first week at First Capital Financial passed in a blur of training sessions, employee handbooks, and the awkward dance of forming new workplace relationships. I said nothing about my personal circumstances, not about Robert, not about the crushing debt, not about the impending divorce. I arrived early each morning, stayed late to absorb extra information, and projected a confidence I was far from feeling. "You're picking this up quickly," my supervisor Diana remarked on Friday afternoon. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had built her career in banking when female loan officers were still a novelty. Most new hires take weeks to get comfortable with our systems. I smiled, not telling her that desperation was a powerful motivator. Every loan application I processed, every financial statement I analyzed was practice for my own situation. Each night, I returned to the house I could no longer afford and spread my own financial disaster across the dining table, applying my new knowledge to my personal crisis. The math was unforgiving. Even with my improved salary, the monthly payments on Robert's secret debts would consume over 70% of my income. The house would need to be sold, but it was underwater, worth less than the outstanding mortgage and home equity line of credit that Robert had taken against it. My small retirement account wouldn't make a dent. Bankruptcy seemed inevitable. Yet something kept me from filing those papers. Pride, perhaps, or the stubborn belief that surrendering was exactly what Robert expected me to do. Sunday evening, as I was preparing for my second week of work, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Natalie? It's Carol Reed. I'm Robert's mother." My hand tightened around the phone. I had always been fond of Carol. Unlike her son, she came from modest beginnings and never quite seemed comfortable with Robert's displays of wealth. "Carol," I said, keeping my voice neutral, "I assume you've heard what's happened." "Oh, Natalie." Her voice cracked with emotion. "I'm so ashamed. I raised him better than this." For a moment, we were silent, two women connected by our shared disappointment in the same man. "He called me yesterday," she continued, talking about some big business opportunity, asking if I could lend him money. When I asked about you, he said you'd grown apart and were handling the separation amicably. A bitter laugh escaped me. "Is that what he's calling it?" "I told him I wasn't born yesterday," Carol said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "That boy never could lie to me convincingly. He finally admitted there was another woman, but Natalie, he said nothing about leaving you with debt." "Would it have mattered?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. "Of course it would," she said firmly. "I didn't raise him to behave dishonorably. I've told him he won't see a penny from me until he makes this right." I sank into my couch, oddly touched by her loyalty even as I recognized it wouldn't change my situation. "Thank you, Carol. But don't damage your relationship with your son. On my account. This is between Robert and me now. He'll come asking you for money soon enough," she said. "When his flashy lifestyle outpaces whatever he took. That's when you'll have your opportunity." "Opportunity?" I echoed. "To negotiate." There was something knowing in her tone. Robert has always valued money above all else. When he needs it badly enough, you'll have leverage. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, Carol's words echoing in my mind. Leverage was precisely what I lacked in my marriage, the ability to influence outcomes, to protect my interests. But Monday morning, when I walked into First Capital Financial as a loan officer with decision-making authority, I would have a different kind of power. I slept better that night than I had since discovering Robert's betrayal. Monday morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill. I dressed with particular care, a charcoal pencil skirt and burgundy blouse that projected competence and authority, items purchased during happier times that now felt like armor. I swept my hair into a sleek bun and applied makeup that highlighted my features without appearing overdone. The woman in the mirror looked capable, professional, someone who made decisions rather than having decisions made for her. At the office, Diana greeted me with a stack of files. "Ready for your first solo applications?" she asked, placing the folders on my new desk. "Nothing too complex to start. A home equity loan, a couple of auto loans, and a small business expansion request." I nodded, eager to prove myself. "I'll have initial assessments by lunchtime." "No rush," she said with a quick smile. Thoroughness matters more than speed. I worked methodically through the morning, applying the training from my first week and finding a rhythm in the analysis of income statements, credit reports, and collateral valuations. There was something satisfying about this work. Clear parameters, objective criteria, and the agency to make recommendations based on evidence rather than emotion. By early afternoon, I had completed preliminary reviews of all but the business loan application. I saved it for last, knowing it would be the most complex and wanting to give it my full attention. The file belonged to a local restaurateur seeking to open a second location. As I reviewed their financial statements, I found myself admiring their careful planning and growth strategy. This wasn't a vanity project or a reckless expansion. It was a calculated risk based on 3 years of steady success at their original location. I was drafting my recommendation for approval when Diana appeared at my desk. "How are you coming along?" she asked. "Just finishing the business loan review," I replied. "Their financials look solid with good cash flow projections. I'm inclined to recommend approval with standard terms." She nodded approvingly. "Good. Analysis. But I'm actually here about a new priority application that just came in. High-value client, fast-track review." She placed a thick folder on my desk, and my stomach dropped as I read the name on the label, Wilson Consulting. "The applicant specifically requested our institution because we're known for our efficiency with business loans," Diana continued, oblivious to my sudden tension. "He's looking to secure funding quickly for a time-sensitive opportunity." With fingers that suddenly felt numb, I opened the folder. There was Robert's familiar signature on the application, along with financial statements that painted a picture of a thriving consultancy ready to expand into new markets. The requested amount, $450,000. "This seems like a complex case," I said carefully. "Maybe someone with more experience should handle it." Diana shook her head. "Everyone else is at capacity. Besides, it's a straightforward application on paper. Strong revenue history, good credit profile. The owner will be coming in tomorrow morning for the initial consultation. It's a good opportunity to get your feet wet with a higher profile client." As she walked away, I stared at the application, a maelstrom of emotions churning inside me. The universe, it seemed, had a perverse sense of timing. Or perhaps, as Carol had suggested, an opportunity had presented itself. I spent the rest of the afternoon and well into the evening scrutinizing every page of Robert's application. The numbers told a story of success, but I knew Robert well enough to sense something wasn't adding up. His projected revenue growth seemed aggressively optimistic. The collateral he offered, primarily the value of his consulting practice, was difficult to independently verify. Most notably, there was no mention of personal financial challenges, no disclosure of the massive debt he had accumulated and left for me to deal with. Either he had somehow resolved those issues in the week since abandoning me, or he was deliberately concealing relevant financial information on a loan application, which was not just unethical, but potentially fraudulent. As I drove home that night, my mind raced with possibilities. Tomorrow morning, Robert would walk into my office expecting to charm a nameless loan officer into giving him nearly $500,000. He would find me instead, the wife he had betrayed and bankrupted, now sitting in judgment of his financial trustworthiness. The irony was almost too perfect. For years, he had controlled our finances, dismissed my capabilities, and kept me dependent. Now, for perhaps the first time in our relationship, I held the power. The question was, what would I do with it? I arrived at the office an hour early the next morning, my stomach knotted with anticipation. Robert's appointment was scheduled for 10 a.m. I had 3 hours to prepare, to steady my nerves, to decide exactly how I would handle this collision of my personal and professional lives. First, I spoke with Diana. "I need to disclose something about the Wilson Consulting application," I said, standing in her office doorway with my hands clasped to hide their trembling. Her eyebrows rose. A conflict of interest? Robert Wilson is my husband. I swallowed. Soon to be ex-husband. We're in the middle of a separation. Diana's expression shifted from surprise to concern. Natalie, you should have told me immediately. We'll need to reassign this. Please, I interrupted, surprising us both with my intensity. I can handle this professionally. More importantly, I have insights into his business that could be valuable to the bank's decision-making process. She studied me for a long moment. This is highly irregular. I understand, but I also understand his financial history better than anyone else could. If there are risks the bank should be aware of, I'm best positioned to identify them. Diana leaned back in her chair. Are you suggesting there might be issues with his application? I chose my next words carefully. I'm suggesting that due diligence is especially important in this case. Robert recently made some significant personal financial changes that aren't reflected in these documents. What kind of changes? The kind that might affect his ability to repay a large loan. Diana's expression hardened slightly. I see. And you believe you can remain objective despite your personal situation? I believe I can separate my personal feelings from my professional assessment, I replied, not quite answering her question. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. I'll allow you to conduct the initial interview and assessment, but I'll be reviewing your work closely and I'll sit in on any follow-up meetings. That's fair, I agreed, relief washing through me. Back at my desk, I spent the next 2 hours preparing as though my life depended on it, because in many ways it did. I reviewed every line of Robert's application, noting discrepancies and preparing questions that would reveal the true state of his finances without betraying my personal knowledge. I researched similar businesses to benchmark his projections against industry standards. I identified the weakest points in his proposal, places where a single question could unravel his carefully constructed narrative. At 9:55, Diana stopped by my desk. He's here. Conference room 3. Are you sure about this? I stood, smoothing my skirt with steady hands. Completely. The 20 steps to conference room 3 felt like walking through molasses. Time seemed to slow as I approached the door, my breathing measured, my posture straight. I was no longer Natalie Wilson, betrayed wife. I was Natalie Wilson, loan officer, about to conduct a standard business meeting. I opened the door. Robert sat with his back to me, his attention on his phone. Even from behind, I recognized the set of his shoulders, the way his head tilted slightly to the right when he was concentrating. He wore the navy suit I had helped him select for client meetings. Authoritative but approachable, the tailor had called it. Mr. Wilson? I said, my voice remarkably calm. I'm your loan officer. He turned, the practiced smile already, forming on his lips, only to freeze as recognition dawned. The blood drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. Natalie, he whispered, his composure shattered. I closed the door behind me and took the seat across from him, placing his folder neatly on the table between us. This is unexpected, he managed after several seconds of stunned silence. Life is full of surprises, I replied coolly. Rather like discovering your spouse has emptied your joint accounts and left you with $300,000 in debt. His eyes darted to the door, as if calculating whether he should simply walk out. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I had seen countless times during our marriage. Natalie, I can explain. We're not here to discuss our marriage. I cut him off, opening the folder. This is a business meeting regarding your loan application. Let's keep it professional. Confusion flickered across his face, replaced quickly by calculation. This was familiar territory for Robert, adapting to unexpected circumstances, looking for leverage. Of course, he said, straightening his tie as he regained some composure. Professional. I've reviewed your initial application, I began, slipping into the script I had prepared. Before we proceed, I need to clarify some points about your financial position. Certainly, he nodded, his businessman persona reasserting itself. I'm an open book. The irony of his statement almost made me laugh. Your application indicates Wilson Consulting has annual revenues of approximately $850,000, with net profits of $320,000. Is that accurate? Yes, those figures are from our most recent fiscal year, he confirmed. And you're seeking $450,000 to expand into international markets, primarily Europe and Asia. Correct. I've already secured preliminary agreements with potential clients in London and Singapore. This funding would allow me to establish satellite offices and hire local staff. I nodded, making a note. Your credit report shows a FICO score of 785, which is excellent. However, I'm concerned about some recent changes in your debt profile. His shoulders tensed slightly. What sort of changes? According to our records, you've recently taken on significant new personal debt. Multiple credit accounts show maximum utilization within the past 2 weeks. Robert's expression tightened. Those are temporary anomalies. I'm in the process of restructuring some personal assets. I see. And what about the second mortgage on your primary residence? That appears to have been maximized very recently as well. His eyes narrowed. These personal matters don't affect the viability of my business loan application. Wilson Consulting operates as an LLC, separate from my personal finances. Mr. Wilson, I said, my tone professional but firm. As I'm sure you're aware, for sole proprietorships and small LLCs, the owner's personal financial situation is highly relevant to any lending decision. Financial instability in your personal life represents a risk factor for the bank. A muscle twitched in his jaw. My personal finances are temporarily in flux due to lifestyle changes. It doesn't reflect on my business acumen or the profitability of my consultancy. Lifestyle changes, I repeated, holding his gaze, such as leaving your wife and traveling to Santorini with another woman. The color that had begun to return to his face drained away again. That's not relevant to this application. Undisclosed. Debt is extremely relevant, I countered, as is financial responsibility and transparency. Your application makes no mention of the joint debts you left behind, debts that legally still belong to both of us. From the bank's perspective, that raises serious questions about disclosure and trustworthiness. Robert leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Natalie, you can't do this. You know my business is solid. This loan is crucial for expansion. I'm simply doing my job, I replied, unmoved. Assessing risk and making recommendations based on complete information, not just the information an applicant chooses to share. For the first time in our relationship, I saw something I had never witnessed before. Robert Wilson, master of manipulation and control, was panicking. The carefully constructed image he presented to the world was crumbling, and he had no idea how to stop it. In that moment, I understood something profound. Robert's power had always depended on others accepting his version of reality. When confronted with objective facts and consequences, he had no defense. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice barely audible. I want to complete my assessment of your loan application, I answered, turning to a fresh page in my notepad. Now, about these projected revenue figures for the European market. They seem unusually optimistic compared to industry standards. Could you walk me through your calculation methodology? As the meeting continued, I maintained my professional demeanor while systematically dismantling the house of cards that was Robert's application. Each question exposed another weakness, another assumption that couldn't withstand scrutiny. I wasn't being vindictive. I was being thorough. Exactly what First Capital Financial was paying me to be. By the end of our hour together, Robert's confident facade had completely crumbled. He knew, and I knew, that his loan application was effectively dead in the water. Without this capital, his grand plans for expansion would evaporate, along with the lifestyle he had chosen over our marriage. "I'll need additional documentation before making my final recommendation," I said as our time concluded. "I'll email you a detailed list of what's required." Robert stood, gathering his materials with unsteady hands. "This isn't over, Natalie." I met his gaze evenly. "You're right. It's just beginning." The moment Robert left the conference room, my professional composure cracked like thin ice. I sank back into my chair, my entire body trembling with a mixture of adrenaline, vindication, and an unexpected wave of grief. Despite everything he had done, seeing him, witnessing the moment he recognized me and realized the predicament he was in, had unleashed emotions I thought I had under control. A soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. Diana stood. In the doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Are you all right?" she asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Yes, that was more intense than I anticipated. She took the seat Robert had vacated. I watched through the glass. "You handled yourself impressively." "You were monitoring?" "Of course," she said with a slight smile. "I couldn't hear the conversation, but your body language remained composed and professional throughout. His, on the other hand." She trailed off, raising an eyebrow. "He wasn't expecting to see me," I said, stating the obvious. "Clearly." Diana studied me for a moment. "Do you want to discuss what happened, or would you prefer I reassign this application?" I straightened my shoulders. "No reassignment necessary. The truth is, his application has serious deficiencies regardless of our personal situation. The revenue projections are inflated, the international market analysis is superficial, and he's concealing significant personal debt that would impact his ability to repay. In your professional opinion, what's the appropriate response?" I considered the question carefully, separating my personal feelings from my professional assessment. "At minimum, we need full disclosure of his current debt obligations and a more realistic business plan with conservative growth projections. Without those, I couldn't recommend approval even if he were a stranger." Diana nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "Draft your preliminary assessment report by end of day. I'll review it before we proceed." After she left, I returned to my desk, forcing myself to focus on other applications for an hour before tackling the report on Robert's loan. Distance, I found, helped me articulate the legitimate concerns with his application without allowing my personal hurt to color the assessment. By late afternoon, I had completed a 5-page analysis that laid out the strengths and weaknesses of Robert's proposal with clinical precision. The document concluded with a recommendation for conditional consideration pending additional documentation and substantial revisions to the business plan, a professional way of saying, "not yet," and probably never without significant changes. I emailed the report to Diana and was gathering my things to leave when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Vanessa. We need to talk, please." My fingers tightened around the phone. The audacity was breathtaking. I typed a response before I could reconsider. "Nothing to discuss. Enjoy Santorini." I was halfway to my car when the phone rang. The same unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Natalie, don't hang up," Vanessa said quickly. "There are things you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice low and controlled despite the anger surging through me. "You and Robert betrayed me. You helped him hide what he was doing." "No," she insisted. "That's not—" She cut herself off with a frustrated sound. "Look, Robert doesn't know I'm calling you, but he came back from a meeting today completely shaken. Something about a loan being denied? He wouldn't explain, but he's been making frantic calls ever since." I stopped beside my car, processing this information. And you're calling me because I think you deserve to know what's really happening, she said. Not just with the two of us, but with Robert's business. Can we meet somewhere? Every instinct warned me to refuse, to protect myself from further manipulation. But curiosity, and the prospect of gaining information that might help me navigate the financial disaster Robert had left me in, won out. Valley Brew Coffee Shop tomorrow at noon, I said finally. 30 minutes. That's all you get. Thanks. You, she breathed, sounding genuinely relieved. I'll be there. That night, in the quiet of my kitchen, I reviewed my own financial documents again, this time with renewed purpose. If Robert's business was facing challenges beyond what his loan application suggested, I needed to understand how that might affect the debts in my name. Would creditors come after me more aggressively if his income dried up? Would the house become even harder to sell? As I made notes and calculated scenarios, I realized something had shifted within me. The paralyzing shock of betrayal had given way to a cold, clear determination. I was done being a victim of Robert's choices. Whatever information Vanessa might provide, whatever desperate moves Robert might make next, I would be prepared. I slept fitfully, my dreams a jumble of conference rooms and bank statements. When I woke, the first thing I saw was a notification that I'd received an email from Robert at 3:17 a.m. The subject line read simply, "We need to talk." The message itself was brief. "Natalie, I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But there's more at stake here than you realize. My business, your financial future, everything depends on this loan approval. Meet me, please. We can work out an arrangement that benefits us both." I deleted the email without responding. Robert had spent years dictating the terms of our relationship. He didn't get to demand negotiations now that the balance of power had shifted. At work that morning, Diana summoned me to her office. She had reviewed my report on Robert's application and agreed with my assessment. "I've sent him the official response requesting additional documentation," she informed me. "He's already called twice asking to speak with the department manager. I've explained that all communication should go through proper channels." "Thank you," I said, relieved that Diana was maintaining professional boundaries despite Robert's attempts to circumvent them. "Has he tried to contact you directly?" I hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. "He sent an email asking to meet. I ignored it." She nodded approvingly. "Good. Keep everything through official channels. Document any attempts he makes to influence you outside the normal application process." As I turned to leave, she added, "Natalie, what you're doing, maintaining professionalism in an incredibly difficult personal situation, is impressive. Not everyone could handle this with such dignity." Her words stayed with me as I worked through the morning. Dignity. It wasn't something I had associated with myself during the past week of emotional chaos. But sitting across from Robert yesterday, maintaining control while he floundered, had awakened something dormant inside me. A sense of my own worth that had nothing to do with him or our marriage. At noon, I walked into Valley Brew Coffee Shop, scanning the midday crowd until I spotted Vanessa at a corner table. She looked different from the confident woman who had toasted champagne with my husband in Greece. Her hair was pulled back in, a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw something unexpected. Fear. Whatever story she had come to tell, it wasn't the one I had anticipated. And, judging by her expression, I wasn't going to like it one bit. I slid into the seat across from Vanessa, keeping my purse on my lap. A small barrier between us, and a reminder that I wouldn't be staying long. "You have 30 minutes, I said, not bothering with pleasantries. Vanessa pushed a cup toward me. "I ordered you a vanilla latte. You still take them, right?" I ignored the gesture. "Say what you came to say." She sighed, wrapping her hands around her own cup. First, you should know that Robert and I aren't together. Not the way you think. The vacation photos suggested otherwise, I replied coldly. It was staged, she said, her voice dropping. All of it. The champagne, the romantic setting, the jewelry. Robert needed evidence of a relationship for someone else's benefit. I was just playing a part. I stared at her, searching for signs of deception but finding only what appeared to be genuine distress. Why would he need to stage a relationship? Vanessa glanced around the coffee shop before leaning forward. Because Robert's in trouble. Serious trouble. The kind that involves people you don't want to owe money to. A chill ran through me. What are you talking about? About 8 months ago, Robert lost a significant amount of money on a high-risk investment. He was desperate to recover before you found out, so he borrowed from less reputable sources. Loan sharks? I asked incredulously. She nodded. The interest rates were astronomical. When he couldn't keep up with payments, they suggested an alternative arrangement. They have clients who need to move money discreetly. If Robert would help with that, they'd forgive a portion of his debt. The implications settled over me like a cold fog. Money laundering. He didn't see it that way at first, Vanessa said. He told himself it was just consulting for international clients with privacy concerns, but once he started, they kept demanding more. The expansion loan he's seeking isn't for growing his business. It's to pay off these people before things get worse. I sat back, momentarily stunned. And your role in all this? I work in marketing for one of these clients, she admitted, unable to meet my eyes. That's how Robert got connected to them initially. When they started pressuring him, he convinced me to help with the Santorini charade. He needed to create a narrative about why he was suddenly changing his life, leaving his wife, traveling. Abroad. It made the unusual financial movements seem like the actions of a man having a midlife crisis, not someone under duress. You expect me to believe this? I asked, though a disturbing part of me already did. It explained the frantic quality of Robert's recent behavior, the desperate need for this loan, and the discrepancies in his financial records. Vanessa reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive, sliding it across the table. Everything's here. Account numbers, transaction records, emails. Robert doesn't know I've been documenting everything, but I've been looking for a way out for months. I made no move to take it. Why come to me now? Because you're the only one who can. Stop this, she said. When Robert came back yesterday saying his loan officer was his wife, I realized this might be our one chance. If he gets that loan, the money goes straight to them, and he'll be even deeper in their world. If he doesn't get it... She trailed. Off, the implication clear. That's not my problem, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Isn't it? Your name is on some of those accounts he used. Your social security number is tied to transactions you never authorized. If this unravels the wrong way, you could face questions from authorities about money you never saw. My stomach clenched. Just when I thought Robert couldn't possibly hurt me more, here was a fresh nightmare. The prospect of being implicated in financial crimes I knew nothing about. What exactly do you expect me to do with this information? I asked, finally picking up the flash drive. Talk to Robert. Get the full truth from him. Then use your position at the bank to help structure a legitimate loan with conditions that force him to cut ties with these people. It might be his only path back to legitimate business. I slipped the drive into my purse, my mind already racing, through implications and possibilities. And why should I help the man who betrayed me and left me financially ruined? Because if he goes down for this, he'll never be able to repay what he owes you, she replied simply. And because despite everything, I don't think you want to see him hurt. Neither do I. After Vanessa left, I remained at the table, the untouched latte growing cold as I processed this new information. If what she said was true, and I had no reason to trust her, but also no reason to doubt this particular story, then Robert's betrayal was even more complex than I had realized. The flash drive in my purse felt like it weighed 100 pounds. It represented both danger and opportunity, evidence that could destroy Robert completely, but also information that might help me protect myself from the fallout of his poor decisions. Back at my apartment that evening, I plugged the drive into my laptop with trepidation. The contents were exactly as Vanessa had described: spreadsheets tracking unusual fund transfers, emails with veiled references to consulting arrangements, and photos documenting meetings between Robert and stern-looking men I'd never seen before. Most damning of all was a folder labeled Natalie, containing digital copies of loan documents with my forged signature, credit applications I had never filled out, and account statements for entities I had no knowledge of. Robert hadn't just left me with debt. He had systematically used my identity to create financial instruments that were now potentially linked to illegal activities. This was my hidden advantage, knowledge that Robert didn't realize I possessed. Information that gave me leverage not just over his loan application, but potentially over his freedom. My phone rang, displaying Robert's number. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. "We need to talk," I said before he could speak. "That's what I've been trying to tell you," he replied, relief evident in his voice. "Not at your office, not at my workplace, somewhere neutral." "Name the place." I suggested a public park near my apartment, open enough to be safe, but with enough privacy for a candid conversation. "Tomorrow, 7 a.m., I said. "Come alone, and be prepared to tell me everything about your financial arrangements over the past year." There was a long pause. "How much do you know?" he finally asked, his voice tight. "Enough to know you're in trouble that goes beyond our divorce or your loan application. Enough to know that you've put me at risk without my knowledge or consent." Another pause. "Natalie, I never meant for any of this to touch you." "And yet, here we are," I replied. "Tomorrow morning. Don't be late." I hung up before he could respond, my heart racing with a strange mixture of fear and power. For the first time since discovering Robert's betrayal, I felt like I had the upper hand, not just because of my position at the bank, but because I now understood the true depths of his situation. That night, I created copies of everything on the flash drive and stored them in multiple secure locations. Whatever happened next, I wanted to ensure this evidence remained accessible. I also drafted an email to Diana, requesting a meeting to discuss potential compliance concerns related to Robert's application. I didn't send it yet. That would depend on tomorrow's conversation. But having it prepared gave me a sense of control. As I finally drifted toward sleep, I realized that knowledge truly was power. Robert had kept me in the dark for years about our finances, about his business dealings, about his true character. That darkness had made me vulnerable. But now, armed with information he didn't know I possessed, I had options he couldn't anticipate. The game had changed. Robert believed he was coming to negotiate with a betrayed wife who held the keys to his loan approval. He had no idea he was actually meeting someone who held the keys to something far more valuable: his future. The weight of the flash drive in my purse felt like both a shield and a burden as I walked into work the morning after meeting Vanessa. The evidence it contained gave me leverage over Robert, but it also implicated me in a web of financial transactions I'd never authorized. My mind raced with possibilities and dangers, making it difficult to focus on the routine loan applications awaiting my review. "You seem distracted," remarked Lena, a fellow loan officer whose desk faced mine in the open office layout. We had exchanged pleasantries during my first weeks, but hadn't moved beyond collegial small talk. "Just a lot on my mind," I replied, attempting a smile that must have looked as forced as it felt. Lena studied me for a moment, then glanced at the clock. It's almost lunchtime. Want to grab something at the cafe downstairs? My treat. The unexpected invitation caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to decline, to retreat into the protective isolation I'd been building around myself. But another part, perhaps the wiser part, recognized that isolation served Robert's interests, not mine. Sure, I heard myself say. Thanks. The cafe was busy with the midday rush, but Lena led us to a quiet corner table she claimed was always available if you know when to pounce. She ordered for both of us, apparently a regular with established preferences. So, she said once our food arrived, what's really going on? And before you say nothing, I should mention that the walls in the break room are thin, and Diana's office isn't as soundproof as she thinks. My stomach dropped. What have you heard? Enough to piece together that your ex-husband is Robert. Wilson of Wilson Consulting. He's applying for a loan with us, and there's some serious financial mess involved. She held up a hand when I started to speak. I'm not gossiping or judging. I'm offering to help. Why would you help me? You barely know me. Lena's expression softened. 3 years ago, my sister's husband drained their accounts and disappeared with his secretary, left her with 2 kids, a mortgage, and $42,000 in credit card debt she didn't know existed. She took a sip of her water. I've seen this movie before, Natalie. Different cast, same plot. The simple act of having someone understand, truly understand without explanation or justification, nearly broke the careful composure I'd been maintaining. I blinked back unexpected tears. How did she handle it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Not well at first, Lena admitted. She was too ashamed to ask for help, tried to manage it alone until it became unmanageable. By the time she came to me, they were facing foreclosure. She set down her fork. That's why I'm talking to you now, because I wish someone had talked to my sister sooner. Over the next hour, Lena shared her sister's story and the lessons they'd learned during her recovery. Practical advice about dealing with creditors, legal strategies for contesting fraudulent charges, even recommendations for affordable therapists specializing in financial trauma. The most important thing Hannah learned, Lena said as we finished our meal, was that treating financial betrayal like a shameful secret only benefits the person who betrayed you. Selective transparency is power. Selective transparency, I repeated, considering the concept. Being strategic about who you tell and what you share, she clarified. Not everyone deserves your trust, but some people have earned it without you even realizing. As we returned to the office, Lena introduced me to Miguel in the legal department, who had helped her sister review debt collection notices. He can tell you which threats are real and which are just intimidation tactics, she explained. Miguel listened to a carefully edited version of my situation, then offered to review any concerning communications I received. Financial institutions use fear to paralyze people, he said. Knowledge is the antidote to that fear. By the end of the day, I had scheduled a meeting with Miguel for later in the week and accepted Lena's invitation to join a small financial recovery support group that met monthly. The isolation I had been cultivating as a form of self-protection suddenly seemed counterproductive. That evening, I did something I had been avoiding for weeks. I called my older sister, Beth. Our relationship had grown distant during my marriage to Robert, who had found her straightforward manner abrasive and her middle-class lifestyle uninspiring. Gradually, family gatherings had become less frequent, phone calls shorter and more superficial. Natalie? Beth sounded surprised when she answered. Is everything okay? No, I admitted, the simple honesty a relief after weeks of pretending. Everything is very much not okay. The story poured out of me. The betrayal, the debt, the job at the bank, the loan application. Everything except the potentially illegal aspects of Robert's business dealings. Beth listened without interrupting, a skill she had developed as a high school counselor. "I'm coming over," she said when I finally finished. "Don't argue, I'll bring dinner." 2 hours later, we sat at my kitchen table with containers of Thai food between us, strategizing as if the years of distance had never existed. "You need a better lawyer," Beth said bluntly. "The one you're using is fine for standard divorce proceedings, but this situation has too many financial complexities." She pulled out her phone. "My friend Jill specialized in high-conflict divorces with financial fraud components before she became a judge. She can recommend someone." While Beth made the call, I felt a strange lightness spreading through me. The burden hadn't diminished, but it was now distributed across stronger shoulders than just my own. "Jill says Marion Kaplan is who you want," Beth reported after the call. "She takes a limited number of cases, but Jill will put in a word if you're interested." "I don't know if I can afford a specialized attorney," I admitted. "My finances are—" "Don't make decisions from a place of scarcity," Beth interrupted. "That's how people like Robert keep winning. At least talk to her, see what she suggests." The next morning, I received an email from Marion Kaplan's office, offering a consultation that afternoon. Apparently, Jill's word carried significant weight. I requested a 2-hour lunch break from Diana, explaining I needed to meet with a specialized divorce attorney. "Take whatever time you need," Diana replied. "Your work is ahead of schedule, and this is clearly important." Marion Kaplan's office projected understated competence. No flashy decor or intimidating legal tomes, just clean lines and organized efficiency. The attorney herself matched her surroundings. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and incisive eyes that missed nothing. "Judge Williams gave me a brief overview," she said after introductions. "But I'd like to hear the situation in your words." Once again, I found myself sharing my story, though this time with greater clarity and purpose. Marion took minimal notes, maintaining eye contact in a way that conveyed complete attention. "Your current attorney isn't wrong in her assessment," she said when I finished. "This is a complex case with significant challenges, but she's missing some strategic opportunities." "What kinds of opportunities?" "Financial discovery that goes beyond conventional assets, forensic accounting to trace where money actually went, and leverage points based on potential violations that might interest regulatory agencies." For the first time since discovering Robert's betrayal, I felt a genuine spark of hope. Marion wasn't just talking about surviving this ordeal, she was outlining a path to justice. "I should tell you," I said carefully, "there may be aspects of Robert's business dealings that go beyond ethical gray areas into potentially illegal territory." Marion's expression didn't change. "That would be relevant to our strategy. Do you have documentation?" I thought of the flash drive in my purse. "Some, and possibly access to more." "Then we have options." She slid a retainer agreement across the desk. "My services aren't inexpensive, but this initial consultation is free, and we can discuss payment structures that accommodate your current situation." The retainer amount made my breath catch. It was nearly a month's salary at my new position. But Beth's words echoed in my mind. "Don't make decisions from a place of scarcity." "I'd like to move forward," I said, signing the agreement. "My previous attorney has files she can transfer to your office." "Excellent. We'll begin immediately. Financial betrayal cases require swift action before assets can be further obscured." As I left Marion's office, my phone buzzed with a text. From Lena. "Support group tonight at 7. No pressure, but doors open if you want to come." The accumulation of small kindnesses and professional support over the past 24 hours stood in stark contrast to the isolation I had been imposing on myself. Robert had left me with crushing debt, but he had also left me with something unexpected: the freedom to rebuild connections his controlling presence had subtly discouraged. That evening, I attended the support group, held in a community center, meeting room with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. 6 women of varying ages greeted me with the particular warmth that comes from shared experience. "We all have different stories," explained Sarah, the facilitator. "But the common thread is financial betrayal by someone we trusted. This is a space for practical support and emotional processing without judgment." For the next 2 hours, I listened to stories that echoed aspects of my own experience: the shock of discovery, the shame of having been deceived, the overwhelming practical challenges of recovery. Each woman was at a different stage in her journey, from raw devastation to emerging stability. When my turn came, I shared a condensed version of my situation, focusing on the emotional impact rather than the specific details. The simple act of speaking my truth to an understanding audience felt like releasing a breath I'd been holding for weeks. "The hardest part for me," I admitted, "isn't even the money. It's reconciling the man I thought I knew with the person who could do this. How do you trust your own judgment again after such a fundamental error?" Heads nodded around the circle. Marianne, a woman in her 60s who had discovered her husband's secret gambling addiction after 30 years of marriage, spoke up. "You learn to separate trusting others from trusting yourself," she said. "The fact that someone betrayed your trust doesn't mean you were wrong to trust. It means they were wrong to betray. And your judgment isn't flawed because you saw the best in someone. That's their failure, not yours." Her words settled into a wounded place inside me, beginning a healing I hadn't known I needed. As the meeting concluded, contact information was exchanged and plans made for coffee with Lena and 2 other women from the group. The network of support expanding around me felt like scaffolding, temporary perhaps, but essential for rebuilding. Walking to my car afterward, I called Beth to update her on the meeting with Marion. "I signed a retainer agreement," I told her. "It's expensive, but you were right about not making decisions from scarcity." "Good," she said simply. "What can I do next to help?" The question brought unexpected tears to my eyes, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of not facing this alone. "Could you come over this weekend? Help me organize financial documents for Marion?" "I'll be there Saturday morning, with breakfast and organizational supplies." As I hung up, a notification appeared on my screen, an email from Marion Kaplan, with the subject line, "First Steps." The message outlined an aggressive but methodical approach to my case, beginning with comprehensive financial discovery. The final paragraph caught my attention. "Remember that you are not defined by what was done to you, but by how you respond to it. Based on our conversation today, I believe your response will be formidable." Formidable. The word resonated as I drove home, a description I would never have applied to myself a month ago. Yet here I was, assembling legal representation, financial expertise, emotional support, and family connections into a foundation for recovery. The woman Robert had left with $300,000 in debt was not the same woman who now parked her car and walked confidently into her apartment. That woman had been isolated, uncertain, defined by her relationship to him. This woman, the one I was becoming, was connected, strategic, defined by her own resilience. Tomorrow morning, I would meet with Robert in the park, armed with Vanessa's flash drive and my newly assembled support system. The confrontation that had once seemed so daunting now felt like simply the next necessary step in reclaiming my life. I slept soundly that night, no longer alone in my struggle, but surrounded by an invisible network of allies, some newly discovered, others rediscovered, all essential to the journey ahead. Dawn broke with a crystalline clarity. The autumn air, crisp and sharp as I walked to the park benches near the duck pond. I arrived 20 minutes early, needing time to center myself before confronting Robert. The evidence on Vanessa's flash drive had kept me awake most of the night, my mind racing. Through implications and possibilities, I chose a bench with clear sightlines in all directions, positioned where I could see anyone approaching. The park was nearly empty at this hour, just a few early joggers and an elderly man feeding the ducks. I pulled my coat tighter against the morning chill, watching my breath form delicate clouds in the air. Robert arrived precisely at 7, punctuality being one of his few consistently reliable traits. He looked haggard, the confident businessman persona replaced by someone more tentative, almost fragile. His normally impeccable appearance showed subtle signs of strain, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his hair not quite perfectly styled. He sat beside me, leaving careful space between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, both staring at the pond where ducks cut smooth wakes across the still water. "Thank you for meeting me," he finally said. "I'm not here for your gratitude," I replied. "I'm here for the truth. All of it." He nodded, rubbing his hands together. From cold or nervousness, I couldn't tell. "Where should I start?" "The real trouble began about 10 months ago, didn't it?" "Not when you left me, but long before." His head snapped toward me, surprise evident in his expression. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter how I know," I interrupted. "What matters is that I do. So let's skip the part where you minimize or lie, and go straight to you explaining how you involved me in money laundering without my knowledge or consent." The color drained from his face. "It's not that simple, Natalie." "Then make it simple," I said, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. What followed was a confession that confirmed everything Vanessa had told me, and revealed even more. Robert had lost nearly $600,000 on a speculative investment, money he'd borrowed against our assets without my knowledge. Desperate to recover before I discovered the loss, he'd connected with investors through Vanessa's workplace, not initially realizing they were using his consulting business to move money of questionable origin. By the time I understood what was happening, I was already compromised, he explained, his voice hollow. They had records of my involvement, transactions that could be interpreted unfavorably. "Blackmail," I said. He nodded. "They started small. A few wire transfers, consulting agreements with shell companies. Then it escalated. They wanted access to more legitimate banking channels. And that's where I came in," I said, the pieces falling into place. "The loans and credit lines in my name." "Your credit history is immaculate," he admitted. "Mine was becoming complicated. Using your information helped avoid additional scrutiny." I took a deep breath, tamping down the surge of fresh betrayal. "And Santorini? The staged relationship with Vanessa?" "They wanted me to establish an overseas presence." The relationship with Vanessa created a cover story for frequent international travel. The entire scenario, leaving you suddenly, the midlife crisis narrative, it made the unusual financial movement seem less suspicious. "Did you consider, even for a moment, what this would do to me?" I asked, surprised by the calm in my voice. Robert stared at his hands. "I told myself I'd fix everything before it affected you. That I'd recover the losses, pay off these people, and you'd never know how close we came to disaster. But things spiraled faster than I could manage. And now you need the loan from First Capital to pay them off." "Yes," he said simply. "Without it, I'm not sure what they'll do next. And I'm afraid they won't just come after me." The implication hung in the air between us. My name was on documents connected to their operations. If things unraveled, I could face questions I couldn't answer, involvement in crimes I hadn't committed. "Why should I help you?" I asked, "after everything you've done?" "Because it's the cleanest way out for both of us," he replied. "If I get legitimate financing, I can extricate myself from these people, pay off the debts that are in your name, give you a divorce settlement that acknowledges what I've put you through." I stood and walked a few steps toward the pond, needing physical distance to think clearly. The ducks scattered, then regrouped, adapting to the disturbance with instinctive grace. In the week since discovering Robert's betrayal, I had transformed from a devastated wife to someone with growing confidence in my own judgment and abilities. The woman who had trusted him blindly for years was gone. In her place stood someone clearer-eyed, someone who understood power and how to use it. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, turning to face him. "I'm going to help structure a legitimate loan application that might pass First Capital's requirements, with stringent conditions and oversight." Hope flickered in his eyes. "Thank you, Natalie. I held up my hand, stopping him. "I'm not finished. In exchange, you will sign a divorce agreement that includes full financial restoration for me. Every dollar you took from our joint assets, every debt you created in my name, you'll take legal responsibility for all of it. You'll provide a written confession of how you forged my signature and used my identity without consent, which I'll hold in reserve should you fail to meet your obligations." His expression tightened. "That's extensive." "It's non-negotiable," I replied. "And there's more. You'll transfer the deed to your mother's house into her name immediately." "My mother's house? How did you know about—" "I know a lot. More than you think, Robert. I know you mortgaged the house she believes she owns outright, the home she's lived in for 40 years and thinks is her security for retirement. Fix that immediately." He looked away, shame finally breaking through his composed facade. "Is that all?" "No. You'll make anonymous donations to women's financial literacy programs totaling $50,000 over the next 5 years. I'll select the organizations and monitor the payments." "Why?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because there are other women like me, women who trust their partners to handle finances and end up vulnerable. The difference is, they might not land a job at a bank or get access to evidence that gives them leverage. They might not find a way out." Robert was silent for a long moment, weighing his limited options. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do it. All of it." "I'll have papers drawn up," I said. "Once they're signed and the transfer of your mother's house is complete, I'll help with a revised loan application." As I turned to leave, Robert called after me. "For what it's worth, I really did love you, Natalie." I paused, not turning back. "That's the problem, Robert. Your version of love left me drowning in debt and implicated in financial crimes. I deserve better. I always did." Walking away, I felt a strange lightness. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Untangling the financial mess would take months, and rebuilding my life would take longer. But for the first time since finding that bank statement with its devastating balance, I felt certain I would survive this. More than survive, I would emerge stronger, wiser, and determined never to surrender my financial autonomy again. Back at my apartment, I made 3 phone calls. First to Diana, requesting a meeting to discuss a complex client situation without revealing the details over the phone. Then to a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague, scheduling an urgent consultation. Finally, to Carol, Robert's mother, inviting her to lunch later in the week. As I hung up from the last call, I caught my reflection in the window, straight-backed, clear-eyed, resolute. The woman who had been blindsided by betrayal was transforming into someone new, someone who used knowledge as power, who set terms instead of accepting them, who would never again be left vulnerable by trusting too completely. The journey ahead would be challenging, but I was finally walking it on my own terms. The meeting with Diana went exactly as I had anticipated. I presented a carefully edited version of what I had learned about Robert's finances, framing it as concerns that had emerged during due diligence rather than revealing the full extent of his potentially criminal activities. "Based on this information," Diana said after reviewing my notes, "his current application doesn't stand a chance of approval." "I agree," I replied, "but I believe there might be a path forward with significant restructuring and oversight." She raised an eyebrow. "You're advocating for him? After everything?" I'm advocating for a solution that protects the bank's interests while potentially resolving a complex situation, I clarified. And frankly, that helps ensure I'm not left holding debts that should rightfully be his responsibility. Diana studied me for a moment. You're suggesting we use the loan as leverage to secure your financial separation from him. Is that inappropriate? I asked, meeting her gaze steadily. After a thoughtful pause, she shook her head. Not if. We're transparent about the conditions and they serve legitimate business purposes. Draft a conditional approval framework with the specific requirements you believe would make this viable. I'll review it before we proceed. I spent the rest of the day crafting a document that would thread an impossibly fine needle. Strict, enough to satisfy the bank's risk management requirements. Detailed enough to force Robert to extricate himself from his questionable associates, and structured to ensure my financial protection without explicitly appearing to serve my personal interests. The framework I created included quarterly audits, restricted disbursement of funds, mandatory financial counseling, and co-signing requirements that would keep Robert on a tight leash for the 5-year term of the loan. It wasn't punitive. It was protective for all parties involved. When I emailed the document to Robert that evening, his response came within minutes. "This is excessive. We need to discuss." I replied with a single line. "My office, 9 a.m. tomorrow. This is the only option available." That night, as I prepared for bed, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Wilson?" a male voice asked when I answered. The formality immediately put me on edge. "Who's calling?" I replied, not confirming my identity. "My name is Diego Sevilla. I'm an associate of your husband's. I understand you're helping with his financing situation." A chill ran through me. This had to be one of the men from the flash drive photos, one of the people pressing Robert for money. "I think you have the wrong number," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't think so," he replied, his tone remaining pleasant, but with an undercurrent that raised the hair on my arms. "Robert has spoken highly of your financial expertise. I thought perhaps we could meet directly, as it seems you're now influencing decisions that affect our mutual interests." My mind raced. How had they found me? Had Robert told them about my role at the bank? Or had they been monitoring him and discovered it independently? "Any business matters should be directed to First Capital Financial during normal business hours," I said, falling back on professional protocol, while my heart hammered in my chest. "Of course," he said smoothly. "But some matters benefit from more informal discussion. Perhaps coffee tomorrow? I could explain certain aspects of Robert's business that might not be apparent from his paperwork." The implied threat was unmistakable. They were trying to pressure me directly now, bypassing Robert. "I'll need to decline," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "All lending decisions follow established institutional protocols. Good night." I hung up before he could respond and immediately turned off my phone. With shaking hands, I double-checked that my apartment door was locked and the security chain was in place. Sleep was out of the question now. Instead, I opened my laptop and did something I should have done days ago. I began documenting everything. Every conversation with Robert, with Vanessa, the contents of the flash drive, and now this phone call. If things escalated, I wanted a clear record of events. By morning, I had created a comprehensive timeline and made 3 additional copies of all evidence, stored in different locations. I'd also drafted an email to a contact at the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI, ready to send if necessary. It was my insurance policy. My way of ensuring that if these people tried to threaten me further, they would face consequences beyond anything Robert had anticipated. At 8:45, I was already at my desk when Robert arrived, 15 minutes early. Himself. Diana had arranged for us to use a small conference room rather than meeting at my open workspace. Robert looked like he hadn't slept. The confident businessman was completely gone now, replaced by someone hunted, desperate. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from me without waiting for an invitation. "Your associate called me last night," I said without preamble. "Diego Sevilla." Robert's face drained of color. "What? I never gave him your number. I swear, Natalie." "Then they're watching you, or me, or both of us." I kept my voice low, even though the room was private. "They know I'm involved in your loan application." "This is exactly why we need to move quickly," he urged, leaning forward. "The terms you've proposed will take weeks to implement. These people aren't patient." "That's not my problem," I replied. "The terms are non-negotiable." "Natalie, you don't understand what they're capable of." "I understand perfectly well," I countered, sliding a folder across the table to him. "Inside is a detailed account of everything I know about your arrangements with these people, including transaction records, dates, names, and the methods used to move money. I've stored copies with my attorney and in other secure locations." He opened the folder with trembling hands, paging through the meticulous documentation I had compiled overnight. "If anything happens to me," I continued, "if I feel threatened in any way, this information goes directly to the FBI. I've already drafted the email." "You would implicate yourself," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The documentation makes it clear that my involvement was the result of identity theft and forgery. I've included evidence of how you used my information without consent, including the forged signatures on loan documents." Robert closed the folder, his expression a mixture of defeat and something that might have been respect. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. "Call them, now." "Tell them the loan is proceeding, but will take 3 weeks for approval due to standard banking procedures. Tell them I'm cooperating, but that pressuring me will only result in delays or denial. And if they don't accept that, then tell them that their options are to wait for legitimate financing or to deal with the consequences of their activities becoming known to authorities. Their choice." Robert pulled out his phone, hesitated, then made the call. I watched as he relayed my message, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Whatever response he received seemed to relieve some of his tension. "They're not happy," he said after hanging up, "but they'll wait. 3 weeks, no longer." "That's all I need," I replied. "Now, about those divorce papers and your mother's house." As we discussed the details of our agreement, I observed the man across from me with new clarity. Robert wasn't evil. He was weak in ways I had never recognized during our marriage. Weak in his need for status, in his inability to admit failure, in his tendency to seek easy solutions to difficult problems. I had mistaken that weakness for strength once, impressed by his confidence and decisiveness. Now I saw those traits for what they often were: recklessness and impulsivity disguised as business acumen. When he left my office an hour later, we had a clear path forward. He would sign the divorce agreement my attorney was preparing, transfer his mother's house back into her name, and comply with all conditions for the restructured loan application. In exchange, I would help him navigate the legitimate financing that would free him from his dangerous entanglements. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a business transaction, the final one between us. And for the first time since our relationship began, we were negotiating as equals. 3 weeks passed in a carefully orchestrated dance of paperwork, signatures, and tense phone calls. I maintained professional distance throughout, treating Robert as I would any high-maintenance client. At First Capital Financial, each document was reviewed by multiple parties: my divorce attorney, Diana, the bank's legal team, ensuring that every angle was covered, every loophole closed. The loan application process became a lesson in precision and foresight. I anticipated Robert's attempts to modify terms and headed them off with clear explanations of why each condition was necessary for approval. When he pushed back on the quarterly audit requirement, suggesting biannual would be sufficient, I simply forwarded him the bank's risk assessment guidelines, highlighting the standard protocols for clients with recent financial irregularities. His objections quieted after that. My divorce attorney, Maureen Kilpatrick, proved worth every penny of her considerable fee. She approached the division of assets with surgical precision, identifying accounts I hadn't even known existed and ensuring they were included in our settlement negotiations. When Robert's attorney attempted to minimize certain investments as speculative and therefore of little current value, Maureen produced documentation showing similar holdings being valued at significant amounts in other contexts. "He's still hiding things," she told me during one of our strategy sessions. "Men like Robert always keep something in reserve, but we've captured the majority of it, and the forfeiture clause in the agreement means if we discover additional assets later, you're entitled to an increased percentage." Working with Maureen gave me insight into the legal structures that powerful men like Robert use to insulate themselves. Trusts, limited liability companies, complicated ownership arrangements that obscured who controlled what. Each revelation was both infuriating and educational. I began taking notes not just for my own situation, but with the thought that this knowledge might help others in similar circumstances. True to his word, Robert transferred his mother's house back into her name. I confirmed this personally during our lunch, watching Carol's expression shift from confusion to shock to tears, as I gently explained that her home had been temporarily moved into a complex ownership structure, but was now legally hers again. "He used my house as collateral?" she asked, her weathered hands trembling around her teacup. "Without telling me?" "The important thing is that it's fixed now," I replied, placing my hand over hers. "And I've arranged for a trust to be established that will protect it from any future complications." Carol studied me with eyes so like her son's, yet filled with a wisdom he had never acquired. "You're doing all this despite what he did to you. Why?" I considered the question carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because helping you doesn't mean I'm helping him." She nodded slowly. "You would have been the daughter I always wanted," she said quietly. "But I suspect you're going to build something better than what Robert could have given you." Her word stayed with me, a reminder that family connections weren't necessarily limited by divorce or betrayal. Carol and I made arrangements to meet monthly for lunch, a relationship independent of her son and my complicated history with him. The divorce agreement was finalized with surprising efficiency, given the complexity of our financial entanglement. Robert signed without protest, accepting full responsibility for the debts he had created and agreeing to a payment plan that would, over time, restore what he had taken. The document included the written confession I had demanded, detailing how he had forged my signature and used my identity without consent. What surprised me most during this process was my own emotional evolution. The white-hot fury that had initially propelled me had cooled into something more sustainable, a steady determination to secure my future rather than punish Robert for the past. This wasn't forgiveness, it was the pragmatic recognition that my energy was better invested in reconstruction than retribution. That shift became apparent even to Robert during our final settlement meeting at Maureen's office. As we reviewed the last details of our agreement, he looked up from the documents with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "You seem different," he said. "I am different," I replied simply. "I expected you to want to destroy me," he admitted. "To use what you know to make sure I lost everything. That would require investing more of myself in you than I'm willing to give anymore," I said, my tone matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Besides, your complete financial ruin would make it impossible for you to repay what you owe me. This way works better for everyone." A flash of something, perhaps respect, perhaps simply resignation, crossed his face before he returned his attention to the paperwork. Maureen caught my eye across the table and gave a slight nod of approval. Later, as we left the building, she remarked, "In 15 years of handling high-conflict divorces, I've rarely seen someone maintain such clarity of purpose." Most clients either cave too easily or get so caught up in vengeance they sabotage their own interests. The loan application process moved forward simultaneously. Diana had approved my conditional framework, impressed by its thoroughness. "This could become a template for other high-risk clients," she remarked during our final review meeting. "You've created something valuable here." The framework addressed not just the financial aspects of the loan, but also incorporated behavioral constraints designed to prevent the issues that had led to Robert's entanglement with questionable financial sources. Mandatory quarterly meetings with a financial counselor, restrictions on international wire transfers above certain thresholds, regular business plan reviews, all designed to guide him toward more sustainable practices while protecting the bank's investment. "You've essentially created a rehabilitation program disguised as loan conditions," Diana observed. "It's both punitive and constructive." "The goal isn't punishment," I explained. "It's protection for the bank, for anyone depending on his business, and yes, ultimately for him too." Diana's expression suggested she found my ability to separate personal feelings from professional judgment remarkable. What she didn't understand was that this approach wasn't selfless. It was self-preserving. Allowing anger to dictate my actions would have kept me emotionally tethered to Robert and what he had done. Creating solutions based on logical consequences freed me to focus on my own rebuilding. On the morning the loan committee was scheduled to make their decision, I received a text from Vanessa. "Leaving town, starting fresh. Thank you for handling this better than either of us deserved." I didn't respond, but found myself hoping she would indeed find a fresh start, far from the complications she had helped create. Her betrayal still stung, but I recognized that she, too, had been caught in a web partly of Robert's making. The capacity for this nuanced perspective was new, another sign of how I was changing through this crucible. The loan committee approved the application with all my recommended conditions. When I delivered the news to Robert via a formal bank communication, his reply was brief. "Thank you. I won't waste this chance." Whether he meant the chance to rebuild his business legitimately or the chance to make amends for what he had done, to me remained unclear. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. I found, somewhat to my surprise, that his intentions mattered far less to me now than they once would have. An unexpected consequence of the loan approval was a marked decrease in my anxiety about potential threats from Robert's former associates. The structured financing gave him a legitimate way to address his obligations to them, while the oversight mechanisms would make it difficult for him to engage in further questionable transactions. Diego Sevilla never called again, and the sense of being watched gradually faded. With the major pieces finally falling into place, I turned my attention to rebuilding my own life. The financial devastation Robert had left me with was being addressed through our divorce agreement, but my future required more than just escaping debt. It needed vision and purpose. I began by addressing practical matters. The house would be sold as part of our settlement, which meant finding a new place to live. I located a small but pleasant apartment within my budget. The first time I had rented a place based entirely on my own preferences and needs, rather than compromising with someone else's. The simple act of choosing paint colors and arranging furniture became an exercise in rediscovering my own tastes after years of deferring to Robert's stronger opinions. Financial rebuilding came next. I created a detailed budget that accounted for my current income and expenses while incorporating projections of how my situation would improve as Robert's repayments accumulated. The discipline of this planning provided structure during a time when so much else in my life felt unmoored. I also began researching financial literacy resources, initially for my own education, but increasingly with the thought of how such information might help others. The more I learned about common financial manipulation tactics, the more I recognized patterns in my marriage that had seemed normal at the time, but were clearly designed to maintain an imbalance of power. Diana called me into her office on a Friday afternoon. exactly 1 month after my first day at First Capital. "Your probationary review came early," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "The executive team is impressed with how you handled the Wilson Consulting situation. Turning a potentially problematic application into a secure, compliant loan showed exactly the kind of judgment we value." I opened the folder to find a formal performance evaluation with ratings far exceeding what any new employee could reasonably expect. "We'd like to offer you a position in our risk management department," Diana continued. "It would mean a significant promotion and salary increase. The role would include developing frameworks for evaluating complex loan applications like the one you created for Wilson Consulting." The opportunity was unexpected but perfectly aligned with the skills I had discovered in myself during this ordeal. "I'd be honored," I replied, genuine excitement rising through the lingering stress of recent weeks. "One more thing," Diana added, her expression softening slightly. "I've been doing this job for 27 years. I've seen people face personal and professional challenges of all kinds. Few would have handled what you've been through with such grace and integrity." Her words touched something deep inside me, a recognition of strength I hadn't known I possessed until circumstances demanded it. The promotion came with a substantial pay increase, accelerating my financial recovery plan and allowing me to begin rebuilding the retirement savings Robert had depleted. More significantly, it positioned me to help shape institutional policies that could potentially protect others from financial exploitation. My first project in the new role was developing guidelines for identifying signs of financial coercion or manipulation in joint loan applications. The indicators I included, one partner being excluded from financial discussions, unusual patterns of account access, signatures that showed inconsistencies, were drawn directly from my own experience. Diana approved the guidelines for immediate implementation across all First Capital branches. "This could prevent situations like yours from developing," she noted during our final review of the document. "Or at least catch them earlier." "That's the hope," I replied, feeling a sense of purpose that transformed my personal trauma into something constructive. That evening, I walked through the house that had once represented my marriage, the home that would soon be sold as part of the divorce settlement. Each room held memories, some good, many now tainted by the knowledge of Robert's deceptions. Yet as I moved from space to space, I felt not grief but a growing sense of liberation. I had entered this house as someone defined largely by her relationship to Robert Wilson. I would leave it as Natalie Wilson, risk management specialist, a woman who had faced betrayal and financial ruin and emerged stronger for the experience. The realization prompted me to do something I had been contemplating for weeks. I took out my phone and sent an email to the local women's shelter, offering to conduct a workshop on financial independence and recognizing signs of economic abuse. Their response came within hours, expressing enthusiasm for the idea and suggesting dates for an initial session. Teaching others would require organizing what I had learned through hard experience into coherent, actionable guidance. I spent the weekend creating an outline, drawing not just on my personal story but on research I had been accumulating. The process was cathartic, transforming painful memories into valuable lessons that might help others avoid similar situations. My phone rang, an unfamiliar number. For a moment, I feared it might be Diego Sevilla or one of his associates, but I answered anyway, ready to handle whatever came. "Ms. Wilson, this is Elaine Mercer from Women's Financial Empowerment Network. We received an anonymous donation with a note suggesting we contact you about possibly speaking at our upcoming seminar series." I smiled, realizing Robert had already begun fulfilling another part of our agreement. "I'd be happy to discuss that. What kind of topics did you have in mind?" "Financial independence, protecting your assets, recognizing warning signs of financial manipulation, anything you feel comfortable sharing from your professional expertise." Professional expertise. The phrase no longer felt like an exaggeration. In my darkest moment, I had discovered capabilities I never knew I possessed. Knowledge I could now use to help others avoid similar pitfalls. I think I could speak quite effectively on those topics, I replied. When is your next event? As I made arrangements to share my experience with other women, I gazed out at the sunset, painting the sky in fierce oranges and pinks. The $300,000 debt that had seemed like an insurmountable mountain was now a problem with a solution, a challenge being methodically addressed. The structure I had created, the divorce agreement, the loan conditions, my new career path, the educational outreach, represented more than just recovery from disaster. It was architecture for a new life, one built on a foundation of self-reliance and clear-eyed understanding of both human nature and financial systems. More importantly, the woman who had felt helpless staring at that bank statement just 1 month ago had discovered her own value, her own voice, her own power. The loan officer position that seemed like mere coincidence had become the pivot point for an entirely new direction in life. Sometimes the universe offers exactly what you need at precisely the moment you need it. Not as a gift, but as an opportunity to reclaim what was always rightfully yours. Your strength, your independence, your future. I had been left with crushing debt and betrayal, but I had refused to be crushed. Instead, I had transformed those circumstances into the foundation for something stronger than what had been broken. Something that would not only sustain me, but potentially help countless others facing similar battles. Women who, like me, deserved better than what had been done to them, and had the power within themselves to create it. 1 year later, I stood at the podium facing a room of over 200 women at the annual Financial Empowerment Conference. My presentation, titled From Financial Victimization to Vigilance, had just concluded to enthusiastic applause. The journey to this moment, from devastated wife to featured speaker, still felt surreal at times. The conference center's bright lights illuminated faces that had been nodding in recognition throughout my talk. Women of various ages and backgrounds, united by a common thread, the desire to control their financial destinies. Some had survived situations similar to mine, others were taking preventive steps to ensure they never would. We have time for one more question, the moderator announced, gesturing to a woman in the third row who had been waiting patiently, her hand raised. After everything you went through, do you regret trusting your ex-husband with your finances? She asked, her expression suggesting she might be in a similar situation herself. Her voice carried a slight tremor, and she clutched her notebook tightly, as if physically holding on to the information she'd gathered today. I considered the question carefully, aware that my answer mattered not just to her but to everyone in the room. It was the most frequently asked question at these events, yet my response continued to evolve as my own healing progressed. I don't regret trusting, I replied, making eye contact with the questioner. Trust is fundamental to any partnership. What I regret is surrendering my financial autonomy, believing that love meant I didn't need to understand our shared finances or have equal input in decisions that affected my future. True partnership requires both trust and transparency, and now I know never to sacrifice one for the other. The woman nodded slowly, jotting something in her notebook. Around her, others did the same, the scratching of pens creating a soft background rhythm. I would add something else, I continued, sensing the importance of elaborating further. Financial knowledge isn't just about protection from potential betrayal. It's about equal partnership in good times too. Understanding your finances, regardless of who manages the day-to-day transactions, means having an equal voice in shaping your future together. That's something everyone deserves, even in the healthiest relationships. The answer seemed to resonate throughout the room. As the session ended, several women approached to share their own stories or ask for specific advice. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes described discovering secret debt after her husband's unexpected death. A young professional confessed her reluctance to merge finances with her fiancé despite his insistence. A retirement-age woman shared how she had rebuilt her life after a divorce, left her financially vulnerable in her 60s. Each conversation reinforced what had become increasingly clear over the past year. My experience, painful as it had been, had value beyond my personal growth. There was a hunger for authentic guidance from someone who had navigated these waters, who understood both the emotional and practical dimensions of financial betrayal and recovery. The conference organizer approached as I gathered my materials. "Your session had the highest attendance of the day," she informed me. "Would you consider becoming a regular speaker at our regional events? We have chapters in 12 cities now." The request was flattering, but would require careful consideration, given my growing responsibilities at First Capital. "Let me check my schedule and get back to you," I replied. "I'm committed to this work, but I need to balance it with my other obligations." After the conference, I checked my phone to find an email from Diana. The subject line read simply, "It's official." The message contained a formal announcement of my promotion to Director of Risk Assessment at First Capital Financial, a position 2 levels above my current role, and one I hadn't expected to reach for at least another 5 years. The accompanying note from Diana was characteristically straightforward. The executive committee was unanimous. "Your framework for high-risk loan assessment has been implemented across all branches and has already prevented several potentially problematic approvals. The role is yours effective next month, with the salary and benefits package we discussed. Congratulations, Natalie. Well earned." The salary increase would allow me to finally purchase a small home of my own, a goal I had deferred during my marriage, but now pursued with determination. I had already begun working with a realtor, focusing on modest properties in neighborhoods with good investment potential. My days of extravagant houses with underwater mortgages were firmly behind me. I sent Diana a brief professional response expressing my gratitude and commitment to the new role. Then I allowed myself a moment of private celebration, standing in the quiet hallway of the conference center, acknowledging how far I had come from that devastating morning when I discovered Robert's betrayal. As I drove home, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed in 12 months. The debt that had once seemed insurmountable was steadily diminishing through Robert's court-mandated payments. My credit score, damaged by his actions, had nearly recovered thanks to the careful financial hygiene I now practiced. The professional skills I had discovered in myself during crisis had blossomed into a promising career path that combined financial expertise with my growing passion for education and advocacy. The women's shelter workshop I had volunteered to conduct had expanded into a monthly series, covering topics from basic budgeting to recognizing financial red flags in relationships. I'd developed curriculum materials that were now being shared, with shelters in neighboring counties reaching women in various stages of vulnerable transitions. Just last week, I had received a handwritten note from a workshop participant. "After 10 years of having no access to our money, I opened my own bank account yesterday. My children and I are making a budget together. Thank you for showing me it was possible." I kept the note pinned to my refrigerator as a reminder of why this work mattered. And Robert? We had minimal contact now, our interactions limited to necessary communications about financial obligations. The loan that had once been his desperate lifeline was being managed according to the strict conditions I had established. Quarterly reports indicated he had indeed severed ties with his questionable associates, rebuilding his consulting business on legitimate foundations. His compliance with our agreement had been surprisingly consistent. The payments came on schedule. The anonymous donations to women's financial literacy programs continued as stipulated. He respected the boundaries I had established, never attempting to leverage our past connection for leniency or special consideration. I didn't wish him ill, but neither did I wish him particularly well. He had become, like so many aspects of that chapter of my life, simply part of my history. a cautionary tale rather than an ongoing source of pain. The emotional hold he once had over me had dissolved, replaced by a neutral recognition of our transactional relationship. Carol and I maintained our monthly lunches, our relationship evolving into a genuine friendship independent of her son. She never pressed for reconciliation or made excuses for Robert's behavior. Instead, she shared stories of her own financial challenges as a single mother raising him years ago, offering a perspective that, while not excusing his choices, helped me understand the generational patterns at play. I never taught him how to fail with dignity, she told me during one such lunch. His father left us with nothing, and I was so determined Robert would never experience that kind of vulnerability that I praised his successes and ignored the small dishonesties. That was my mistake. We all have blind spots with those we love, I replied, finding compassion where I once might have harbored judgment. My new apartment, while modest, represented something profound, space that was entirely mine, paid for with money I had earned, decorated according to my tastes alone. No compromises, no deference to someone else's preferences. The freedom was sometimes dizzying but always exhilarating. I had painted the living room a soft sage green that Robert would have dismissed as bland, but that I found calming after long days at work. The furniture was selected for comfort rather than status. The artwork chosen because it spoke to me rather than because it impressed guests. Every element reflected choices made with my own well-being in mind, a novel concept. After years of considering someone else's preferences paramount, that evening, I hosted a small dinner party, something I would never have done in the immediate aftermath of my separation, when shame about my financial situation might have prevented me from inviting others into my life. My guests included Carol, who had become a friend independent of her connection to Robert, 2 colleagues from work who had supported me during the tumultuous early days at the bank, and Mia, a single mother I had met through the Women's Financial Empowerment Network, who is now pursuing her accounting degree. I had prepared a simple but elegant meal, another area where I was rediscovering my own preferences after years of deferring to Robert's expensive tastes. The conversation flowed easily, touching on work challenges, Mia's classes, community events, and occasionally, the shared experience of rebuilding life after significant setbacks. I never would have applied to college if I hadn't come to your workshop, Mia confided as we cleared the dishes. Hearing your story made me realize I could take control of my situation instead of just surviving it. Her words struck me deeply. The idea that my darkest experience could illuminate someone else's path forward seemed like the most meaningful alchemy possible. As we shared dessert, the conversation turned to my upcoming house hunting. My guests offered suggestions for neighborhoods, recommendations for home inspectors, and warnings about hidden costs of ownership. The practical advice was valuable, but more precious was the sense of community it represented, a network of support I had built entirely separate from my life with Robert. After my guests departed, I curled up by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. My phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found a photo of a document, a receipt for a $10,000 donation to the Women's Financial Empowerment Network. The second installment of the 5-year commitment I had required from Robert. No message accompanied the receipt, nor was one needed. This wasn't about gratitude or reconciliation. It was simply confirmation that agreements were being honored, obligations met. That was enough. I set the phone aside and returned my gaze to the cityscape. Somewhere out there, other women were facing betrayals similar to mine, discovering debts they didn't incur, untangling financial deceptions, rebuilding from ruins. Some would have resources and support. Others would face these challenges alone. My work with the Empowerment Network was aimed at reaching the latter group, offering both practical guidance and the simple assurance that survival was possible, that thriving was possible. The journey from that moment of devastation, staring, At the bank statement showing nearly $300,000 in debt, to this peaceful evening had been neither straight nor easy. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of fury so intense it threatened to consume me. Nights spent awake strategizing next steps. Days when the magnitude of rebuilding my financial life seemed overwhelming. But each challenge overcome had reinforced an essential truth. I was more capable than I had ever given myself credit for. The skills I had allowed to atrophy during my marriage, decision-making, financial analysis, self-advocacy, had not disappeared, but merely lain dormant, ready to be reawakened when circumstances demanded. The loan officer position that had seemed like cosmic coincidence now felt more like destiny, the universe providing not a rescue, but an opportunity to rescue myself. To discover strengths long dormant, to reclaim power long surrendered. My new journal lay open on the side table, part of a practice I had begun 6 months earlier. Each evening, I recorded one observation, insight, or accomplishment. A ritual that helped me notice progress that might otherwise have gone unacknowledged. Tonight's entry would be about Mia's comment, about the profound privilege of helping someone else find their path to empowerment. Tomorrow, I would finalize the paperwork. On my new home, a 2-bedroom craftsman with a small garden where I plan to grow herbs and flowers. Next week, I would begin my director role at the bank, bringing fresh ideas for financial education initiatives alongside my risk assessment responsibilities. The following month, I would lead a workshop for women emerging from financially abusive relationships, sharing both technical knowledge and the emotional wisdom hard-earned through experience. My calendar stretched forward, filled with commitments of my own choosing, goals of my own setting. The future I was creating bore little resemblance to the one I had envisioned during my marriage. It was more meaningful, more authentic, and entirely my own. This was perhaps the most profound transformation of all, the shift from a life that happened to me to a life I actively shaped. From defining myself in relation to someone else to recognizing my inherent independent worth. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't just older than the one who had trusted blindly and paid dearly for that trust. She was fundamentally different, more grounded, more discerning, more confident in her own judgment. The woman whose husband had left her with crushing debt no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and fully her own. Someone who understood that the greatest power doesn't come from controlling others, but from governing yourself, your choices, your finances, your future. That night, I slept peacefully, untroubled by regrets about the past or anxiety about what lay ahead. The journey hadn't ended, it never truly would, but I faced it now with confidence born of hard-won wisdom. No one could take from me what I refused to surrender. Not my financial security, not my self-worth, not my capacity to build something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. I was the architect of my own restoration, and the foundation I had laid would support not just my future, but potentially the futures of countless other women who might find in my story the courage to reclaim their own. Part 11. Final Test. 18 months after Robert left me with crushing debt. Life had settled into a new normal that sometimes surprised me with its richness. My position as Director of Risk Assessment at First Capital had expanded to include developing financial literacy programs for the bank's community outreach initiatives. The modest home I had purchased, a 2-bedroom craftsman with morning sun in the kitchen, had become a true sanctuary. My workshops at women's shelters and community centers continued to grow in attendance and impact. The legal and financial aftermath of Robert's betrayal had largely resolved through Marion's skilled handling. The structured payment plan was steadily reducing the debt burden, my credit score had recovered, and the emotional weight of the ordeal had diminished to occasional twinges rather than constant pain. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office when my assistant Drew appeared in the doorway with an unusual expression. concern mixed with hesitation. "There's a Detective Rivera here to see you," he said. "He says it's urgent but won't specify the nature of his visit." My stomach tightened. Did he mention if it's personal or bank-related? "He just asked for you specifically." I nodded, straightening the papers on my desk. "Send him in, please." Detective Michael Rivera was a compact man with observant eyes and a deliberately neutral expression. He presented his credentials before taking the seat I offered. "Ms. Wilson, I'm investigating certain financial transactions associated with Wilson Consulting," he began without preamble. "Based on records we've obtained, several accounts bearing your name were used in what appear to be questionable transfers between 2022 and 2023. The calm I had cultivated over months of recovery threatened to fracture. This was precisely the scenario I had feared when I first discovered Robert's activities, being implicated in financial improprieties I knew nothing about. "These accounts were opened and operated without my knowledge or consent," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I discovered their existence only after my separation from Robert Wilson, at which point I took immediate steps to document the fraud and distance myself from these activities." The detective's expression revealed nothing. "Do you have documentation supporting this claim?" "Extensive documentation," I confirmed. "My divorce settlement includes a notarized statement from Robert acknowledging his unauthorized use of my identity, along with forensic accounting reports tracing the actual control of these accounts." Something shifted subtly in Rivera's demeanor, perhaps a slight relaxation around the eyes. "That would be extremely helpful to our investigation. May I ask what exactly you're investigating?" "Mr. Wilson and several associates are under investigation for money laundering and wire fraud. The case has been building for some time, but recent evidence has accelerated our timeline." My mind raced. Robert had been complying with the loan conditions, making his scheduled payments, seemingly rebuilding his business legitimately. Had it all been another deception? "I'll need to contact my attorney before sharing documentation," I said. "But I want to be clear that I had no knowledge of or involvement in any illegal activities." "That's perfectly reasonable," Rivera nodded. "And for what it's worth, your name came up primarily as a potential victim of identity theft, not as a suspect. Your ex-husband's former associate, Vanessa Parker, provided testimony that corroborates your lack of involvement." Vanessa. The name triggered a complex emotional response, residual anger at her role in Robert's betrayal, mixed with grudging appreciation for her eventual cooperation. "Ms. Parker reached a cooperation agreement several months ago," Rivera continued. "Her information has been instrumental in untangling the financial structures Mr. Wilson and others established. I thought of the flash drive Vanessa had given me, the evidence I had leveraged to protect myself without fully exposing Robert's activities to authorities. Had Vanessa made a different calculation? After Detective Rivera left with my attorneys, contact information, I sat motionless at my desk, absorbing the implications. Robert was under active criminal investigation. The carefully negotiated arrangements I had established, the loan conditions, payment schedules, divorce settlement, could all be disrupted if he faced charges. My phone began ringing almost immediately. Robert's name flashed on the screen. I declined the call, needing time to process and strategize before engaging. Seconds later, a text appeared. "Police just left my office. We need to talk. Please." I forwarded the message to Marion without responding to Robert, then called her directly. "I just heard from Detective Rivera," she said when she answered. "I've been half expecting this. The structured conditions you established for Robert's loan created a paper trail of legitimacy that made the remaining illegitimate transactions stand out more clearly to investigators. Will my arrangements with Robert be compromised by this investigation? That depends on how extensive the charges are and what assets might be frozen or seized," Marion replied. "But the documentation we created works in your favor. Your divorce agreement and the forensic accounting we commissioned clearly establish your victimization rather than participation. Should I speak with Robert? There was a brief pause before she answered. Not without preparation. If you feel compelled to meet, let's discuss strategy first and consider having the conversation in my office. 2 hours later, I sat in Marion's conference room as Robert was shown in by her assistant. He looked haggard, his customary polish dulled by obvious stress. The confident businessman who had once dominated every room was gone, replaced by someone visibly facing consequences he couldn't charm his way out of. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said, taking a seat across from me. Marion sat at the head of the table, a neutral but watchful presence. "What do you want, Robert?" I asked directly. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "The authorities are freezing my business accounts pending their investigation. I can't access the funds I need to make your payment this month, and I don't know how long this situation will last." Of course, this was about money. It was always about money with Robert. "That sounds like a problem for your criminal defense attorney," I replied, my tone neutral. "Natalie, please. I've been honoring our agreement faithfully for over a year. This investigation, it's about old activities, things that happened before our arrangement. I've been operating legitimately since the loan approval." I studied him, searching for signs of the manipulation that had once been so effective against me. But all I saw was desperation, the raw fear of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse. "You told me you had severed ties with your former associates," I said. "I did," he insisted. "But some transactions can't be undone so easily. There are records, patterns that established before I changed course." Marion interjected smoothly. "Mr. Wilson, are you asking my client to waive the payment schedule established in your divorce settlement?" Robert hesitated. "Not permanently, just until I can regain access to my accounts or establish alternative business arrangements." "And if you're convicted?" I asked. "If you serve time?" The possibility hung in the air between us, heavy, with implications. Robert seemed to physically shrink before my eyes. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I honestly don't know what happens then." The woman I had been 2 years ago would have felt panic at this uncertainty. She would have worried about the financial setback, the potential loss of promised restitution. But I was no longer that woman. "Marion, could you give us a moment?" I asked. My attorney raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll be just outside if you need me." When the door closed behind her, I leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen, Robert. I'm going to continue with my life, my career, my home, my advocacy work. These things no longer depend on your payments or promises. But the settlement is important, but not essential to my well-being," I finished for him. "That's the difference between us now. You're still defining success as financial control. I've discovered it's about something else entirely." He looked genuinely confused. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I won't waive the settlement terms. Those remain legally binding. But I also won't allow your current crisis to become mine. If payments are delayed due to asset freezes, we'll address that when the legal situation clarifies." "Just like that?" he asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "Just like that," I confirmed. "Your chaos doesn't have to become my chaos anymore. That's what financial independence actually means." As I spoke the words, I recognized their truth. Despite the potential disruption to the payment schedule, I felt no fear, no destabilizing anxiety. My financial security no longer hinged on Robert's actions or reliability. I had built safeguards, savings, and a career that could weather this storm. After Robert left, Marion returned with an appraising look. That was unexpected, but not unwise, I hope. "Actually, quite strategic," she replied. "You maintain the legal position while demonstrating psychological independence. That creates better negotiating ground if adjustments become necessary later." The detective's visit and Robert's subsequent plea triggered a flurry of activity over the following weeks. Marion worked with the prosecutor's office to ensure my financial interests were protected regardless of the case's outcome. Diana and the bank's legal team reviewed the loan conditions to determine potential impacts if Robert's business operations were significantly disrupted. Throughout this whirlwind, I maintained my daily routines: work, volunteer commitments, social connections, finding stability in these structures rather than in the uncertain outcomes of Robert's legal troubles. "You seem remarkably calm about all this," Beth observed during our weekly sister dinner. "The possibility of losing the settlement payments would have sent you into a panic a year ago." "A year ago, I was still measuring my worth by financial metrics," I replied. "Now I understand that resilience isn't about having everything secured. It's about knowing you can handle whatever comes, even if it's not what you planned for." The investigation proceeded with the methodical pace of complex financial cases. Robert remained free on bail, but was required to surrender his passport and report regularly to authorities. His business operations continued under strict monitoring, enough to maintain basic functions but with every transaction scrutinized. 3 months after the initial detective visit, Marion called with news. "Robert has reached a plea agreement," she explained. "He's providing evidence against larger players in exchange for reduced charges. As part of the arrangement, certain personal assets will be exempt from forfeiture, specifically those earmarked for your settlement payments." "So the payments will continue?" "Yes, though there may be a restructured schedule based on the terms of his probation and reduced business operations." The prosecutor understood the importance of not penalizing a financial fraud victim, in pursuing justice. After we discussed the legal details, Marion added something unexpected. "This outcome is partly due to your approach, you know. By establishing legitimate structures for Robert's business through the loan conditions, you created a framework that allowed for this resolution. If he had remained fully embedded in illegal operations, the case might have ended very differently." The irony wasn't lost on me. The constraints I had imposed on Robert, initially to protect myself and the bank, had ultimately provided him a path to lighter consequences than he might otherwise have faced. That evening, I received a letter delivered by courier to my home. Robert's handwriting on the envelope was instantly recognizable. For a moment, I considered returning it unopened, but curiosity prevailed. Inside was a single page, handwritten rather than typed. "Natalie, I'm taking responsibility for my actions through a plea agreement that will likely include probation rather than incarceration. This outcome allows me to continue operating a scaled-back version of my business and fulfilling my financial obligations to you, though the payment schedule may require adjustment. What I want to say, which I should have said long ago, is that I recognize the harm I caused, not just financially, but by betraying your trust and attempting to undermine your confidence." The woman who sat across from me in Marion's office, self-possessed, clear-eyed, unwavering, is who you always were beneath the insecurities I deliberately fostered. There is no adequate apology for what I did, so I won't offer one. Instead, I acknowledge the reality. You have built something stronger from the wreckage I created, while I am facing the consequences of choices I made believing I was untouchable. The payment schedule may change, but my obligation to you never will. Robert. I folded the letter and placed it in a file with other documentation related to our divorce, not because the words held emotional significance, but because they represented another form of acknowledgement that might prove useful if future disputes arose. What struck me most wasn't Robert's recognition of his wrongdoing, though that represented growth I hadn't expected from him, but my own emotional response to the letter. I felt neither vindication nor resentment, neither satisfaction nor distress. I felt primarily detachment. Robert's journey, like his approval or remorse, was no longer central to my story. Later that week, I met with the women's shelter director to discuss expanding our financial literacy program. As we reviewed curriculum materials, she commented on the comprehensive nature of the fraud protection module. Most programs just cover the basics, she said. This addresses sophisticated manipulation tactics that many educators don't even recognize. Those tactics are often dismissed as complex financial matters beyond the average person's understanding, I replied. That framing itself is a form of control, making financial knowledge seem inaccessible to maintain power imbalances. She nodded thoughtfully. You've turned your experience into something transformative for others. That's remarkably rare. Her observations stayed with me throughout the day. The investigation into Robert's activities had initially seemed like a threat, a potential disruption to the stability I had worked so hard to establish. Instead, it had become the final test of my transformation, proving that my rebuilt life could withstand even this challenge. The woman who had once been devastated by financial betrayal now faced potential payment disruptions with calm strategic thinking. The woman who had once defined her security through her husband's success now maintained her equilibrium despite his legal troubles. This was perhaps the most profound victory. Not that Robert faced consequences or acknowledged his wrongdoing, but that neither outcome determined my well-being. I had built something that stood independent of his actions, his choices, his fate. That night, I updated my journal with a simple entry. Today, I realized the final link in the chain has broken. What happens to Robert, good or bad, no longer defines any part of my life. Freedom isn't just financial after all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.